Furthermore, was this concern with what they call the party spirit. Essentially, that referred to denominational names, and really tying up your identity in being a Baptist, a Methodist, Presbyterian, a Quaker, an Episcopalian, and all these kind of names, and that the names were essentially causing people to divide. And ultimately, what they wrote in the last will and testament was the idea that it was these kind of things that had led to the division, with all these human creeds that people were required to ascribe to. All of those kind of things were part of the problem. Also very important, and this is important both for the Stone movement and the Campbell movement, and this was true in the 19th century as well. A lot of people believed that the millennium was close at hand. Now, what they meant by the millennium was this idea of this period of 1,000 years, hence millennium, 1,000 years of, let's say, peace, prosperity, righteousness, advancement of human society, people living by the laws of Christ, and something very positive, a time period very positive. And usually connected with that was also the belief in the return of Christ. Now, some people believed during this time that human society would not necessarily improve until Christ came. And when Christ came, he would inaugurate the millennium. So these people were known as pre-millennialists because they believed the second coming would come before the millennium. Other people believed that the second coming would come at the end of the millennium, right? So that human society would advance, they'd inaugurate the millennium, and then Jesus would return. And so they were post-millennialists. So they believed that it would come after the millennium. Stone was more of a premillennialist. Campbell, on the other hand, was more of a postmillennialist. Stone was more of a pessimist to some extent about human nature, what human nature could achieve. But both of them thought that the millennium was close at hand.
And Stone was a premillennial.
He was more premillennial.
And who was post?
Campbell. Alexander Campbell. But
in this sense, you believe that they believe Christ was going to come after them.
Right. So you have you will not, human effort will inaugurate the millennium.
Human effort.
Yeah. And then so for postmillennialists, this is why in some sense you see so much social concern in the 19th century, is that a lot of people were postmillennialists, that they were trying to improve society, believing that if they are going about evangelizing, doing missionary work, if they are increasing literacy, if they're getting the Bible in the hands of people, say if the American Bible Society, for example, if you have prison reform, decrease in alcoholism, try to get rid of prostitution and dueling, reform prisons, right? If you do all that, that's going to bring about the millennium.
This is talking, and this is the time period of this is 1800s still?
Yes. Yeah, we're talking 1800s.
And still in the 1900s, didn't we have more of that too?
There was that. Yeah, I mean, the post-millennialist view really takes a hit with the Civil War because it opens up a lot of, at least for American Christians, opens up the eyes to the horrors of what human beings can do to themselves and how you can lose hundreds of thousands of your own countrymen, right, in such a division. But World War I is also kind of the end of the post-millennialist viewpoint, where most people after that point are premillennialists in thinking, that human effort is not going to change society. It's only going to be the return of Christ. Now, there's also a view that develops in the 20th century. It's more what we may call an amillennial view, which would say that, and all of this comes from Revelation chapter 20, which talks about the 1,000-year reign, millennium. The amillennial view says that that's not talking about reign of Christ on earth, that it's talking about something different. But that's kind of a third option in that.
I never heard of it.
Yeah, that's well, you'll hear it in a couple weeks toward the end of the semester in Revelation. We'll talk about that in that class.
So a millennium is not talking about the second coming.
Yeah, the millennium is something spiritual, not something that's going to take place on earth. Would be the amillennial view. But most people, most Christians in the 19th century would have been either pre or post.
Okay. So a millennium, you said that's 20th century.
That's more something that really becomes popular during the 20th century. But particularly for Stone, one of the things that was prohibiting the millennium was the amount of division that existed in Christianity, because we couldn't bring together everybody. And so if we could bring everybody together, which he believes only will take place when Christ returns, although he hoped for it, right? He thought that this would take place, but he is at various points in his life very pessimistic about that. So particularly for Stone, he wants to get rid of all these different names and simply refer to the Church of Christ and use that name as opposed to Baptist, Methodist, Presbyterian, feeling that is a scriptural name.
Excuse me, I apologize. Stone?
Stone.
Okay.
Now, Campbell more preferred the term disciples of Christ.
Okay.
And we'll talk about that here in a little bit as to why he supported that.
That young man told me that somebody, Campbell was the man that made churches of Christ, or that made the term.
Yeah, I mean, and certainly the phrase had been around before that. You can find some places in England and those kind of things. Yeah. And of course, Paul uses the phrase "churches of Christ" in Romans chapter 16. But essentially, the whole goal that Stone has is that all these other names are not necessarily biblical names, and so let's just use a biblical name instead of trying to divide ourselves.
So Stone is associated with the Church of Christ.
He's the one that really starts to popularize the idea of let's just use that term, and then get rid of all these other names. We'll be the Church of Christ. Now he doesn't think of it as a denominational name, and a lot of people today in Churches of Christ don't use it as a denominational name. But as far as like one option among many, he says, let's just kind of drop all these other names and just refer. All Christians should just be part of the Church of Christ, right? That Christ has one church.
So he's popularized.
Yeah, and so he's the one that kind of tries to promote that, and also with that, just refer to ourselves as Christians as opposed to a Baptist, Presbyterian, Methodist, Anglican, Episcopalian, etc.
We have so many other people that today. This is the most popular thing I think now. That Church of Christ is a denomination too. It's man-made.
Yeah, and certainly as we go through, we'll see how there are certain aspects of that where it's become that to some people, but that's not what Stone really wants to see. It's kind of this, again, with the restoration. It's kind of let's eliminate some of these things that are keeping us divided, and as long as we try to, if we're grouping ourselves around some of these names, we're not experiencing the union that Christ had called for.
Oh, and just one more thing, very quick. Campbell, what denomination was associated with Campbell?
Well, he prefers the name Disciples of Christ. So just like Stone, they're not wanting to start a denomination. They're wanting to kind of get rid of denominational and kind of bring about union.
Oh, okay. So I was under the impression during the readings online that it was to start a denomination. So that was
that's not what they're trying to do. They're trying to bring back what they see as apostolic Christianity. They're trying to just use terminology that's biblical. And so, for Stone, it's let's use phrases like Christian, let's use Church of Christ. For Campbell, not that he felt Christian was wrong, but he preferred the term disciples of Christ to refer to followers of Christ. Let's call ourselves disciples.
Okay, so that's why they were saying that that they had deviated from the apostolic model.
Right. Yeah. And so there's like, here are terms that are used in the New Testament that refer to Christ followers. That should be the terminology we use to refer to ourselves when we follow Christ. There were some other things too that Stone also began to believe. Rejection of the Calvinist views of predestination, right? That God had chose some to be saved, some to be lost. As a Presbyterian, of course, he had believed and preached infant baptism, probably even performed some infant baptisms. But eventually he'll move towards believer's baptism, suggesting that the candidate for baptism is someone that is able to express their faith. So kind of coming in line more with the Baptists. But for Stone and a lot of the other people that are following him for a while, it is not what we might call an essential. It starts off as, we believe this is what Scripture is teaching, but we're not going to make it a test of fellowship. Right? So there's kind of an openness there still in those early years. But eventually, they do become convinced that believer's immersion is more the scriptural apostolic pattern. So he encourages that the focus should be simply ministers of the Church of Christ. And we talked about some of this other stuff. I forgot I had that on a slide. So just using the name Christian, being ministers of the Church of Christ as opposed to Baptist Church, Presbyterian Church, and then some of those other views on salvation and baptism. After that transition, Stone will preach that message, but there are a couple of different things that will happen that he will have a very difficult time of it. Economically, Campbell and Stone kind of take different trajectories. Stone grew up in a fairly well-to-do household, upper middle class, and then gradually through his life, his economic status will decrease. Campbell goes the other way. Not that his family was poor, but they weren't necessarily upper middle class, but he will be on the higher end economically toward the end of his life. And so Stone experiences a variety of struggles through the middle part of his life. His wife dies, and he will get married again. Out of that, he'll have to move several times because of some economic problems. He really won't find a congregation to preach for that can support him. And so he has to open a high school in order to support his family. And will actually later on become principal of an academy. He's still preaching. He's still starting congregations, but it's financially it's not enough to support his family, and so he's doing some other things. In northern Kentucky, some of the churches that are shaped by Stone decide, well, you need to be preaching full time, and so they decide that they're going to band together to try and help him financially, they have some very positive plans about this, but then a financial depression comes through, and so all those plans come none. While there were some attempts to try and support himself preaching, they don't really work out. He will eventually also have to start farming as well to help support his family. So really towards the latter part of his life, there's a lot of economic challenges that he faces. It's the opposite. I mean, he doesn't start poor, but he does end up very, very financially well off.